Hey there, this is Dr. Mort Orman, and today I'm going to finish up this five-part series on why it's beneficial to think of our mind as an elevator. Then we can go up and down different levels, and basically there are three main levels we've been talking about this week: the high level or main floor level, thoughts and beliefs that we tend to have, conscious thoughts and beliefs. Then you can go down one level and you'll find more underlying core philosophies. And then if you go down one more level to the deepest level, you'll find some very basic presuppositions that most people aren't even aware they have, or they aren't aware that they're presuppositions. They seem to be things that we all just assume to be true, that that's just the way life is, or that's just the way relationships are, or that's just the way money is, or some basic presuppositions that we don't even call into question. But sometimes you can change presuppositions. We all have the ability to change our own presuppositions, but throughout history we've seen certain, social presuppositions undergo massive change. So for example, there was a point in time where everybody just presupposed that the world was flat, and that was just the reality. It wasn't something they believed, it was just a fact. It was just taken for granted, and it was passed on from generation to generation. And then we know that that presupposition eventually got overthrown and replaced. Similarly, over 100 years ago, Einstein changed one of our basic presuppositions. I mean, we look around and we see our world in three dimensions, and we assume that life is three-dimensional. And everybody presupposed that. It wasn't something you thought about. It wasn't something you argued about or debated. Obviously, it is. It's what's so. And Einstein came along and said, no, 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 no. It's not three dimensions. It's actually four dimensions. And he developed an elaborate theory to really demonstrate how that's the case. And now there are people questioning even the four-dimensional model that Einstein came up with. And they're now talking about even more dimensions of life that we can't determine very easily, but that have to exist mathematically, scientifically, all that kind of stuff. So there's historical examples of presuppositions that have been shared by a large number of people that have been changed fundamentally over time. But we all have the individual capability to do that ourselves. So one really good example, I know when I was years ago when I was growing up, I read a book called The Inner Game of Tennis by Tim Galway. And actually Tim has gone on to write several more books. He's one of the founders of the sports psychology field. And he also more recently wrote a book called The Inner Game of Stress, which is pretty relevant to our area of interest here. But anyhow, he's a classic example of somebody that made a fundamental change in a basic presupposition. He was, at the time, he had just graduated college. He went to Harvard, it was an education major, and he wasn't sure what he was going to do, so he decided to teach tennis lessons for a while. And he just had this idea one day: what if I changed the basic presupposition of being a tennis teacher and people coming to me to learn how to play tennis? What if I, instead of assuming they don't know anything about it and I have to give them all this instruction and mechanical instruction about how to execute the strokes and blah, 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 what if they already had a natural ability to play tennis and to execute the strokes perfectly? And what if my job as a tennis teacher, instead of trying to build all that into them and give them a whole bunch of instructions, which is just going to put them in their heads and confuse them, what if my job was to figure out how to get that natural tennis player out and express itself? And he actually took that on as a challenge. He wasn't sure it was true or not, but he just decided he was going to play with that presupposition. And damned if he didn't do it. And he created this amazing system for teaching people how to play tennis that didn't involve all the typical instructions that tennis teachers gave. And he became very famous for this. He could do things that other tennis teachers couldn't do. And it all came from flipping this one presupposition about what it is when someone comes to you as a teacher to learn how to play tennis. How do you see them? How do you view them? And he completely changed how he looked at them. Now, I've had examples in my own life, and maybe you have in yours, where I've dramatically, intentionally flipped a presupposition, and it had an enormous impact on my life. So one of the first ones I ever did was around exercise, and particularly around running. And I had lived my whole life into my 30s not ever enjoying exercising. I played a lot of sports and things like that, but as far as actually getting down to just pure exercising or running or jogging, I just hated it. I thought it was miserable. And I had a presupposition that that's just the way it is. That's the truth about running. That's the truth about most kinds of exercise, is that it's painful, it's unenjoyable, it's hard, it's difficult. And one day I decided to flip that presupposition. And I actually said to myself, what if I'm completely wrong? What if the truth about running is that it's absolutely easy, effortless, and enjoyable? Mostly effortless and enjoyable. Okay? What if that were true instead of the presupposition that I had, that it's the opposite? Could I actually turn myself into someone who enjoyed running and did it in a way that was easy and relatively effortless and full of enjoyment and not full of pain and effort and struggle and misery? And I had, at the time I flipped that in my mind, that flipped that presupposition, I had absolutely zero idea whether it was true or not, and I had zero confidence that it was true, but I wanted to explore it. So I actually decided to run a marathon out of that intention, and knowing that I would have to learn how to enjoy running if I was going to do it, because I wasn't into masochism. All right, and I actually was able to do that over a period of 3 or 4 months. I discovered all kinds of ways in which I was turning running into an unenjoyable activity, and as I identified them one by one, I stopped doing them. And lo and behold, running became enjoyable, it became easy, it became fun, and it completely transformed my life. Out of that one, I want you to understand, is what led to it was this one mental flip, this one willingness to consider that the way I thought the world was constructed wasn't really true. Excuse me. That's what I mean about the power of a presupposition. And I went on and I ran 5 marathons successfully, and I taught other people how to run marathons, and I continued to run long distance for 25 years, continued to enjoy running for all that period of time. All of it came, it's like a big bang theory. It's like it came from that one big bang where I changed a fundamental presupposition and that I had that I thought was true, but it turned out that's not the truth about life. It's not the truth about running. And I did the very same thing with stress. I went from the presupposition that life itself is stressful, that stress is just inevitable, that you can't get away from it. It's just part of life, to completely the other side. And I flipped that presupposition. I said, what if life isn't stressful? What if stress isn't inevitable? What are the implications of that reality? What if that were true? What would it mean? Well, one of the things it would mean that somehow, if I'm experiencing stress, somehow if it's not life that's being stressful, I must be somehow generating that stress. And guess what? I was. I didn't know how I was at the time. I didn't even know not only how I was doing it, I didn't even know that I was doing it. But when I flipped that presupposition and I started to live in a world where I started to believe, at first without any evidence at all, okay, started to believe that life itself isn't stressful, therefore I must somehow be generating that stress. I don't have the foggiest idea how I'm doing it, but my intention is to find out. And again, lo and behold, over a period of time, didn't happen overnight, I identified many different ways in which I was contributing and causing the stress in my own life. And out of identifying those activities that were going on inside me, those thought processes, the behavior process, I was able to identify them, and then guess what? I started seeing them in other people. I started helping other people identify them, and they started having reductions and relief from their stress. And so my whole 30-year career, 30-plus year career of helping people deal with stress all came from this one presupposition flip that I made in my own mind, of my own free will, that was very unusual. Most people wouldn't want to think that way or wouldn't dare think that way. I was willing to do it. I was willing to explore the implications, and it paid off tremendously. So this is why I spent this week talking to you about the 3 levels of the mind, and how the most important level is the level of presuppositions. Because not only do our presuppositions keep our higher level beliefs and philosophies in place, and they're difficult to change if they're being held up by a presupposition that you don't ever identify or challenge. But if you get down to the level of working with presuppositions, identifying ones that you have, experimenting with the idea of flipping a presupposition and see whether you can actually create a better life from that new, first imagined reality to making it into a real reality, you have no idea how powerful that can be. So that's what I want to leave you with for this week. Again, there are 3 blog posts that you can reference that talk about this issue of treating your mind as, or imagining your mind as an elevator, and there's 5 videos that go along with that. So please feel free to look at these and review them and enjoy them, and I'll talk to you again next week.